Hello and welcome to Theology Deep Dive, and today we will be looking at a question by one of our listeners about the relationship between Jesus, the Trinity, and the law of identity. So let's dive in. So hello and welcome, my name is Patrice Petel, and today we'll be looking at a question by one of our listeners about the law of identity and how do Christians understand the relationship between Jesus, Yahweh, or the God of the Christians, and how does this work with the law of identity? And this is a common objection, and I appreciate the question. I really do appreciate the question. It was a very thoughtful question, and I think it deserves an answer, a good answer. Hopefully, this is what I'll be giving you today. So, does Jesus and Yahweh violate the law of identity? And so we need to clarify what is meant by the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. So indeed, this is a common objection that the Trinity, if Jesus is Yahweh and Yahweh is tripersonal, then Jesus must be tripersonal. And this is a common objection. And obviously, this is one that many thinkers in the past have addressed. But I do want to address it again today because of the frequency with which I meet this. Now, so you must understand that in the Christian understanding, the Trinity is not three gods, so it is not tritheism. Neither is it strict Unitarianism. So it is one God, one divine essence, and three divine persons sharing this one divine essence. And this is a very important distinction. So the law of identity is a basic law of logic. If something is identical to itself, it will share all the properties. And in my last episode, where I was talking about the indissolubility of identity, well, I was, it's like an logical entailment of the law of identity. So, which is why it is such a basic law. Now, this question, why I like it, because it cuts to the heart of whether or not the doctrine of the Trinity is actually logically coherent, and which is why it's important to answer it. Now, so again, what is the law of identity? If A equals A, then everything that is true of A is also true of A. Which is, well, if you've done any math at all in school, you will understand that if two quantities are equal, then it's the same quantity. So, essentially. So, and this is a related principle, like I was saying, of the indissolubility of identical, which I was talking about last time. If X equals Y, then everything that is true of X is also true of Y. And the objection is typically framed as such. Yahweh. Premise 1, Yahweh is tripersonal. Premise 2, Jesus is Yahweh. Premise 3, therefore, or conclusion, summary conclusion, therefore Jesus is tripersonal. But Jesus is not tripersonal, he is one person. Therefore, the doctrine is contradictory. At first glance, this seems like a valid application of the law of identity, but it rests on a confusion between different categories. So, the category of essence and the category of personhood. Two different categories, which is why you cannot mix them up. So, what is the difference between essence and personhood? Let's clarify these categories. So, the term Yahweh does not refer to a person, it refers to one divine being. It is a personal being, but it is one divine being. And this divine being, this essence or nature of God, and this is what the name Yahweh refers to this whole being. It is the name about the whole being. So the Christian doctrine of the Trinity teaches that there is one divine being, Yahweh, who exists eternally as three distinct persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, so when we say that Jesus is Yahweh, we're not saying Jesus is the Trinity, or that Jesus is the Father, or that Jesus is the Spirit, or that Jesus is the Father and the Spirit. What we are saying is that Jesus shares fully and eternally in the divine essence, in the one divine essence. that he is the same nature or the same essence as the one true God. So he shares this essence with the one true God. So therefore the conclusion that Jesus must be tripersonal is based on a category error, confusing the category of personhood with the category of essence. All right? So it treats a property of the divine essence, tripersonality, as if it must be a property of the divine person, Jesus. But person and essence are distinct concepts in Trinitarian theology. So, and this essentially commits the modal fallacy, no pun intended. So this objection commits what is known as the modal fallacy. This fallacy occurs when someone incorrectly assumes that what is necessarily true of the whole must also be necessarily true of its parts. And so the Trinity is necessarily tripersonal. Jesus is Yahweh, therefore Jesus is necessarily tripersonal. But there's again a confusion, a category error, and a modal fallacy. Because what is true of the whole is not, what is necessarily true of the whole is not necessarily true of the parts. So this is indeed fallacious. So the tripersonal of Yahweh is a feature of the divine being in its totality. It's not a property of any one of the persons of the Trinity in particular. Jesus is a distinct person who possesses the full divine essence, but he is not the entire divine essence considered as tripersonal. The fallacy here is transferring a necessary property of the whole, tripersonality, to one of its distinct person, so Jesus. Now, which is where the confusion stems from. So the confusion stems from confusing, again, the essence with the personal distinction within the Trinity. Now, at this point, some of my fellow Christians might have a difficulty in expressing the difference within God, because traditionally in classical theism, classical theists both, the question came from a Muslim friend. So both in Islam and in Christianity, many in the history of both traditions have affirmed a robust and very strong form of divine simplicity. Now, this was not the only view in the history of both traditions. There was also what is known as the attributionist view. Now, for my absolute simplicity friends that hold to this more classical form of classical model of God, this might be a problem, because what simplicity says is that every property in God, every characteristic or every attribute of God is identical to his essence. Now, given the law of indiscernibility we saw last time, and we saw a little bit earlier today, it's hard to figure out why and how there could be distinction within the Trinity in terms of the three persons of the Trinity. And this is a very, very strong objection against the Trinitarian theology if one holds to divine simplicity or an absolute form of divine simplicity. It's not so much an objection if one holds to the attributionist view of God, which sees God not as a composition. Although he is complex, the attributes, they are true. There are real extramental properties within God, that so you can qualify these properties in God, and they correspond to real attributes in God. This is not just in the mind of the theologian. So true extramental properties. So God is complex, but he's not a composition. He's not made out of parts. He's just complex being, although he is one being, one whole being. So there's complexity in God, but not composition. God is not made up of parts, but he does have real distinctions within his being. And this allows for the kind of language that says Jesus is Yahweh, while still preserving that Jesus is not the Trinity. And so this is important. Obviously, although I don't want to get into the whole idea of incarnation today, I'll need to make another episode on the incarnation. What the incarnation does say, though, is that in the one person Jesus, after the incarnation, so once God incarnated himself, so the second person of the Trinity became man. So once he became man, and by becoming man, he did not lose his divinity. He did not lose the divine part of him. He was still sharing in the same essence as the divine being, the whole divine being, same essence. But then he shared also one essence with humanity. He shared our essence. So he became fully man and fully God. He shared our substance. One substance with God and one substance with man. So there's a distinction also there, and we must not confuse this distinction. So the man Jesus, who is also the God Jesus, why? Because he shares in both substances. He shares in his essence with God, and he shares with his substance with us. And so we must not conflate the two. But I don't want to overreach today because it's still a very dense and short episode, so I'll make it short. But I will be addressing the doctrine of the incarnation later on. Now, there are biblical affirmations, so the Bible does teach several, and that Jesus is Yahweh. So there are several key passages in the New Testament that say this. There are many, many more than what I will be sharing today. But let's just say that I will stick to these, and these are sufficient in my mind to show that the Bible does teach that Jesus is Yahweh. So in John 8:58, Jesus will say, "Before Abraham was, I am," and Jesus uses the divine name for himself. So in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when God expresses his name, so I am who I am in Exodus, the Greek in the Septuagint will use the same phrase here as where Jesus says here in John 8:58 that I am, ego eimi. So in Philippians 2:6, Jesus existed in the form of God and yet took on a human form. Hebrew 1:3, Jesus is the exact imprint of God's nature. These do not mean Jesus is the Father or the Spirit. They mean he shares fully in the divine essence. He is God in the flesh, the second person of the Trinity. So in summary, Yahweh refers to one divine essence or one divine being, and the Trinity teaches that this one divine essence exists as three persons. So Jesus is Yahweh in terms of essence, not in terms of being tripersonal. The objection mistakenly transfers properties of the whole to the part, the necessary properties of the whole, and wants to make them necessary properties of the part, which is the modal fallacy. It also confuses personhood and essence, which is a category error. And as an attributionist, I affirm real distinctions within God, God's attributes, and person without denying his oneness or introducing composition. So, final takeaway, I will say that Jesus is not the whole Yahweh, but he is fully Yahweh. He is not tripersonal, but he shares in one divine essence, and the law of identity stands, and therefore it's not an objection against the Trinity per se, when the Trinity is properly explained, properly defined. When the doctrine is properly clarified, there is no problem with the identity of Jesus as God. All right, so this was great. See you next time, and God bless you.